We have two speakers here. The first speaker is Michael Taft. Michael is one of Ireland's best bloggers. He won Blog of the Year a few years ago on the Vincent Browne programme on TV3. The blog is notes on the front, and I think a lot of us use it in all sorts of different ways and always find it very enlightening and very entertaining as well. So over to Michael.
Thank you to Social Justice Ireland for inviting me here, and thank you for the report by Professor Clark, Dr. Kavanagh, and Niamh Lennon. I want to focus on one particular part of the section on growth and decent work, and that is the chart that has to do with low pay, because I think that really comes out at you. And I want to take a look at that, look under the hood, and see what are the issues involving not only why we have low pay, but what are the obstacles in overcoming it. Now, as part of a backdrop, I want to kind of establish where we are in terms of national income. GDP has been getting a bit of a bashing this morning, and rightfully so. In one sense, it's not all that meaningful for Ireland because GDP is not fit for purpose, as we know, with the impact of multinationals on our national accounts. We used to be able to say, oh, well, GDP is not great, but we'll use GNP. But unfortunately, with the change in the way they account for national accounts, that's no longer fit for purpose either. But the CSO has done a good job in creating what's called GNI Star. And what they have done is they've taken GDP and GNP and said, let's pull out, as best we can, all that multinational activity. I mean, there's aircraft leasing, onshoring of intellectual property and R&D, re-domiciled companies, contract manufacturing, all those things that multinational companies' accountancy departments get up to when they're let off the leash. And what they have done is create probably the best guide that we have. Not precise, but the best guide we have as to terms of what our national income is. And essentially, it takes a 30% out of our GDP, a huge chunk, and leaves us with this GNI Star. But when you look at it, we are still the third or fourth highest income economy in the EU. After all that, factoring out all that, essentially all that whipped cream, we're the third or fourth. So just keep that in mind, because in the focus on low pay, as part of the same OECD data set that I'm sure that the authors of the report worked with, that showed Ireland having nearly one in four workers on low pay, it also showed that Ireland had the second highest level of low pay in the EU. So we go from being the third or fourth highest income to having the second highest level of low pay, behind Latvia. So why is this so, and what can we do about it? I'm going to kind of veer in between the low pay threshold, minimum wage, and living wage. Low pay threshold and the living wage are about approximately the same at this point. And I would say that there's I want to go through quickly, four structural obstacles to addressing the issue of low pay. Because I know that a lot of people who support the living wage argue, and quite rightly to argue, that what we should be doing is trying to push up the minimum wage to the living wage. In other words, create a statutory floor up there. But unless we are mindful of the impacts and the obstacles ahead of us, we're likely, first off, not to achieve it and create considerable perverse consequences. The first structural flaw is that whereas workers in our peer group, which is essentially the EU 15 minus the Mediterranean countries, so it's the continental countries, Northern and Central European economies, workers in these economies, many of them get about half of national income, about half. The average is about 46, 47%. We get far lower. Workers receive a far lower share in wages from the national income. It is so low that just to reach the average of the EU, of our EU peer group, just to reach the average, every worker would have to receive an additional 8,000 euros a year. Every worker. For a couple, 2 people working in a household, 16,000. That has nothing to do with increasing economic activity. All that is about getting an average share of that national income. I would suggest to you that's a political choice. That's a consequence of political policies that we don't have that average share. And it's not something that's just post-recession. This is endemic historically throughout the economy. So that's the first flaw, a low share. Secondly is the economic context, or what I should say, it has to do with what might be called in the broadest possible sense a social wage. In European economies, you have, of course, the direct wage, which people get in their pockets, but then that is supplemented by a range of public services and income supports. That's usually called the social wage. So that I have an income, but that's complemented by the state providing free education, free health care, strong illness benefits, strong state pension, all those things that round out my life, so that I don't have to rely on my income to purchase those things. This is called the social wage. The problem in Ireland is that is extremely weak compared to other countries. And it can create problems if we are not careful when we try to push up pay. I'll give you an example. In Dublin, housing makes up 47%, nearly 50%, 47% of the living wages income. For a living wage, somebody on living wage, or wants to get the living wage, nearly half of that goes on housing. And we know that rents are rising at about 10% a year. And demand is greatly outstripping supply. So the problem, what would happen, do you think, if all of a sudden you started increasing the pay of people, and they're usually the lower pay who are tenants, you start increasing their pay, or increasing the pay of those who are seeking rental accommodation. The problem is there's a danger that you will accelerate the inflation, you will accelerate that, which means that the pay, whether it's the pay from your employer or a minimum wage or whatever, will have trouble keeping up. If it does, what is happening to the productive economy? Because the employer is no longer paying the worker for these increases. They're actually paying the landlord. The worker just happens to be the conduit. It goes in one pocket and out the other. And I would suggest that for the productive economy, for businesses in the market economy, to have to pay to subsidize landlords is extremely inefficient, extremely burdened, and is not sustainable in the long term. And it's usually, when that happens, it's usually the workers who will eventually pay. We can do this also with public transport fares. We have one of the least subsidized public transport systems in Europe. Essentially, and so if the fares are being driven up because of the lack of subsidy, employers are essentially subsidizing the state's failure to invest in public transport, the state's failure to invest in health care, which means we have to pay full GP and all that. So we see that kind of problem. So that's the economic context. To give you an idea, if rent in Dublin were increased by 20 euros a week, just 20 euros, it would mean a pay increase of 80 cents an hour for those on low pay. That's the difference. That's the difference. So when we look at issues of low pay and their living standards, that's what's been emphasized here, we have to look at a broader thing than just the pay package. We have to look at that part of the social wage and that social package. The third obstacle we have is in our indigenous market economy. And what I mean by that is the Irish-owned businesses in the private sector. Market economy excludes the public sector. So essentially the private sector, among the companies that are Irish-owned, we have an over-concentration of employment and economic activity in the low-value-added, low-wage sectors. 40% of workers in the indigenous market economy over 40% work in either the distributive or the hospitality sectors. That is, wholesale retail, hotels, restaurants. The comparable figure in Europe is 30%. Workers in those countries are more likely to be involved in manufacturing and other higher value-added activity. Now, I say this just concerns the indigenous sector. You can see the problem with that imbalance. If you're trying to raise low pay, but they make up a disproportionate amount in sectors, by the way, that are themselves low value added and low waged, you're going to have an imbalance of how that wage spread is given. I would suggest it would be easier to do that if we had more jobs and higher wages in other sectors. It would make it easier to help the low paid. So sometimes it's not even just about strategies that focus on the low pay, but focus on the wider structure. And the last flaw I want to talk about, and something which I think that the trade union movement has not very well communicated, but that is the issue of collective bargaining, or rather the issue of power in the workplace. And to me, my mind, this is probably one of the most important, but one of the least discussed. We are a relatively low-paid economy. Well, of course we are. If we have a labor share that low, we're going to be. Not all sectors, though, are relatively low-paid against our peer group. ICT, for instance. But that's a cyclical thing. I have a high skill, and it's in demand. So I can probably do a good job of bargaining up my wage, because there's a lot of employers looking for me. Of course, there was a lot of high-skilled professionals and crafts workers prior to the crash. And right now, a lot of them are on much reduced pay, and a hell of a lot of them had to emigrate. So just because you have a high skill and it's in demand today, it might not be down the line. But for instance, today, ICT is doing well. Other sectors are doing very badly. And for instance, among the low-paid sectors, hospitality and distributive, these are the lowest of the low-paid in Europe. Now, why is that? As long as these other things, why is that? I would argue is because they have very little bargaining power. It's called collective bargaining. That's about when workers combine and negotiate through a single agency with employers. Not as individuals, where they're isolated, atomized, could easily be picked off. When they combine at the firm level, at the level of the company, or when they do it across sectors, so that you have all the unions and workers in the retail sector negotiating with all the employers in the retail sector, which is called sectoral collective bargaining, which is the dominant form of bargaining on the continent. They have more power and can affect their working conditions and their wages a lot more effectively if they don't have that power. To give you an idea, two things I'd put in favor of that proposition. In countries which have higher collective bargaining coverage, in some countries like Austria and France and Denmark, 80 to 90% of workers are covered under a collective bargaining agreement. Here it's only a third, and half of that is public sector. So it's hardly anybody in the private, not hardly anybody, but a very small proportion in the private sector that's covered. There, 80 to 90% is covered. In those same countries, they have higher wage equality or lower inequality. Now, I'm not suggesting at all that that's exclusively down to collective bargaining, because in those countries with high collective bargaining coverage, where there's wage coordination, you'll also find social democratic architecture, which means that they have strong in-work benefits due to a strong social insurance system. They have universal public services. They have that whole range of things, but key to that is collective bargaining. The second thing I would point out is we can actually see an example of it here in Ireland itself, between public sector pay and private sector pay. Now, I'm sure we all remember at the beginning of the crash and the beginning of the crisis, all the attacks on public sector workers, because they were so highly paid, really highly paid. They were vampires sucking the life out of the economy. Well, there's a couple things about that. First, they had collective bargaining. Private sector workers didn't. And private sector workers were doing worse than their counterparts in Europe. So was it the public sector pay was too high, or was it the private sector pay was too low? But secondly, when people were attacking public sector workers, what they were really doing was they were attacking the lower paid. Because if you look at the graphs which have been done by the CSO on a very detailed like-for-like comparison, it shows that public sector workers in the lower income deciles were the ones who were the greatest beneficiary of the premium. of the fact that public sector workers would pay more. And as you went along the income scale, the higher up you went, the lower that premium became, so that at the very top, public sector workers were paid less than private sector workers. In other words, under this collective bargaining in the public sector, the wage structure was more egalitarian. So I would argue then that the lack of bargaining power is a major obstacle to raising pay in the economy. So those are the four flaws. Lower wage share compared to our EU peer group. That whole social economic context where you're battling against, where essentially you're relying on private provision in what in some other economies would be publicly provided. Thirdly, the unbalanced structure of the Indigenous market economy, and fourth, the lack of bargaining power. Now, I just say in conclusion, this is not a counsel of despair. I actually believe that one day the living wage should be the statutory floor. Don't forget, the living wage really took off very shortly after it was announced. And now you have journalists, you see it you see it in the Business Post every week. There's always some reference to the living wage. It has become part of the dialogue. But what we need to do is look at the obstacles and the strategies to overcome that obstacles, not as an excuse to delay. This is not about saying low-paid workers, well, they'll have to wait. No, they're the ones who shouldn't have to wait. Others might have to wait. They shouldn't have to wait. But unless we deal with these, I think that we're going to be in difficulties. But if we do, then hopefully the next time that Professor Clark, Dr. Kavanagh, and Niamh come and present this, that graph on low pay will be a lot lower. Thank you.
Just to assure Michael that we'd never consider him providing us with a counsel of despair. Of all the people I know, he'd be up there very high in the opposite spent, actually, in the opposite space, as promoting and maintaining hope in difficult times. But anyway, thanks, Michael. Now moving on to our final respondent, Niamh Garvey is head of policy in Trócaire, and the reason I think we asked her to come and reflect, because to do something quite different, we wanted two different people who had two very different kind of areas of interest and work. Maybe obviously they cross over, but that we asked Niamh to take a serious look at some of the international issues here, and she's going to share those with us now. Thank you.
Thank you. I just have a couple of slides that we'll get.
Amen.
Great, thanks. And so while we're just waiting for the slides to get set up, I just wanted to thank Social Justice Ireland and the authors of the report for the opportunity to come and reflect on some of the global perspectives in relation to the report today and the Sustainable Development Goals more broadly. Right, thank you, Eamon. Just check I've got this working. Yeah. Okay, so I suppose just to highlight that one of or two of the key principles in the Sustainable Development Goals is the principle of universality, that the goals apply to all countries and everyone, and the principle of leaving no one behind. So these are two really important principles that underlie all of the goals. And it does mark them, I suppose, as different from their predecessors, the Millennium Development Goals, which were very much seen as something that were for developing countries and richer countries would help their delivery. So I think it's really valuable and really a mark of progress that the Sustainable Development Goals apply equally to Ireland as elsewhere. But in terms of them putting them into practice, in terms of Ireland or any state's obligations under the Sustainable Development Goals, it means operating at three levels. So on the one hand, it's about tackling poverty, inequality, and environmental issues here in Ireland, as we've just heard reflected on. But it also means providing the necessary funding and support to developing countries to help them in their delivery of the Sustainable Development Goals. And thirdly, it means ensuring policy coherence for development, or contributing to global well-being. So the first of those, as we really reflected on this morning in terms of today's report. And so I'm going to focus more on the second two of those three levels. And I think in particular in this year, in 2018, when Ireland will be reporting its first voluntary national review of its progress on the Sustainable Development Goals, it's really important to think of how Ireland will report not just of how it's progressing within its domestic policies, but how it's supporting and impacting on their delivery globally. So as I said this morning, we've already looked at that, so I'll focus on the other two. But before going into the other two, I should reflect that I guess it's not necessarily the norm for countries to report on all three levels. And I think Germany, in its 2016 voluntary national review, is one of the rare examples where a country did so. So this slide just takes a quote from the German voluntary national review, which referred to the principle of universality as meeting all 17 Sustainable Development Goals, both in national policies and internationally. So it refers to the three levels. Firstly, with regard to implementation and impacts in Germany. Second, with regard to impacts in other countries and on global public goods, e.g. global well-being related to trade or climate. And thirdly, with regard to supporting other countries through their international aid or cooperation programme. So I guess I'd really challenge Ireland, as it considers its voluntary national review this year, to also seek to report at the three different levels. So to take that second one, providing funding and support to developing countries to help them achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Well, today's report, I suppose, gave a very clear picture of the trends in terms of official development assistance. So this slide is taken from the report, and it really illustrates that ODA from Ireland currently stands at just 0.33%, which is significantly down from the height of 0.59% back in 2008, and very far off our commitment to delivering 0.7% of GNI. So the report this morning, I suppose, really rightly scores Ireland poorly with regard to this particular indicator. And in Trócair's submission to the budget in 2007, we therefore really recommend the establishment of a cross-party political initiative to propose a medium-term strategy to get Ireland to that 0.7 target by 2025. However, another dimension, I guess, when considering overseas development assistance is to reflect on the quality. So it's less easy to measure, but the quality is a really important measure, because I guess not all aid is necessarily poverty focused or delivered in the most effective way. And so for Ireland, this graph, it might be a little bit difficult to see there on screen, but essentially taking the three Scandinavian countries as about Denmark, Finland and Sweden, who appear highly ranked on other aspects of the Sustainable Development Goals. This slide here illustrates how Ireland outperforms even these Scandinavian countries on measures of transparency, reducing burden, building institutions and efficiency. Ireland is this black line here, where it's scoring highly on the four measures, whereas the other diamonds inside refer to Denmark, Finland and Sweden's performance in this measure. So while we do need to highlight the worrying lack of progress on aid volume, I think it is really important also to recognise and commend Ireland in terms of the quality of its aid, particularly in a context where there are significant negative pressures on aid quality. So the use or misuse of overseas development aid for, I suppose, self-interest of the countries who are donating, rather than in the interests of recipient countries. So again, I guess in our submission to the budget, we would have highlighted the significant role Ireland has played to safeguard aid quality at the international level, and really recommend Ireland continues to act as this champion. I think today's report and the conclusions really highlighted partnership with developing countries as a big opportunity for Ireland. And certainly while our aid volumes are too low, I suppose we have a strong body of aid quality that would be a really strong basis for that sort of partnership approach as recommended in the report. I think one challenge in particular would be Ireland would, in its Irish Aid programme, I suppose highlight in particular goals 1 to 5 as key areas that it would support developing countries on. And I think in terms of Ireland reporting on its sustainable development goals, it would be a challenge to see, well, how might Ireland specifically account for the contributions it makes to particular goals in its priority programme countries. I'd be interested to tease out and discuss that. So moving then on to the third area, ensuring policy coherence for development. So policy coherence for development predates the Sustainable Development Goals. It's enshrined in the EU Lisbon Treaty and has a history before that as well. And policy coherence really is a recognition that the activities of any one country has impacts beyond its own borders and can negatively or positively impact on other countries or contribute to global well-being. And so common policy coherence for development type issues include, but non-exhaustively, issues around climate change, issues around tax policies, debt, trade, investment, intellectual property rights, and corporate accountability. So the mechanisms that we have to ensure, I suppose, strong business and human rights principles in Irish-owned companies that operate overseas. So just to take a couple of these. Tax came up in our discussion this morning, and I suppose it was really interesting to see in the report that when Goal 17 was considered, the ranking from Ireland fell from 12 out of 15 when it was just looking at its ODA volume down 2 places to 14 out of 15 once indicators on tax havens and financial transparency were included. So given that this slide here illustrates that overall illicit flows dwarf ODA. So this one here is foreign aid from OECD DAC countries, the brown column, whereas outflows of illicit finance is more than double. So it's a really significant, a really critical issue in terms of that policy coherence for development, and it was really good to see it highlighted so clearly in this morning's report. To take another example of policy coherence for development, climate change. So for TROCRA, climate change is probably the most significant policy coherence issue. It's a priority area for our advocacy because of the profound impact it is having. It's creating and it's sustaining poverty. And critically, it's really going to severely limit the ability of states to achieve many of the Sustainable Development Goals unless it's adequately addressed. So today's report focused on the indicator around CO2 emissions per capita and ranks Ireland 10th relative to the other EU 15. This ranking is comparable to other rankings, such as the Climate Performance Index, that measures a slightly wider set of environmental indicators, and that index places Ireland 21st overall, but in and around 10th in relation to the EU 15. But here I would have 2 further reflections. So 10th might not sound too bad in relation to sort of our peers, but this graph, I keep pressing the wrong one. This graph here illustrates per capita emission for a selection of developing countries, Ethiopia, Malawi, Kenya, Honduras, and the Philippines, and for Ireland, north and south here. And I think it's really clear the huge difference in those relative environmental footprints. Ireland's emissions dwarf those of the average person in many developing countries. And this is a huge issue of injustice because it's those who have done the least to contribute to the problem of climate change who are very much at the front lines of the impacts of climate change. And so when considering, I suppose, our relative progress around our emissions per person, I think it needs to be done within that context of our contribution to a global problem that is having really severe impacts on developing countries. And secondly then, and this is sort of my final reflection really, is the direction of travel in terms of our climate obligations. So while Ireland has dropped from 12th to 21st in the CPI rankings, it's because largely we are very much off track in terms of our emission reductions targets. So this slide here takes Environmental Protection Agency figures, and what this orange line here shows is the emissions reduction pathway that Ireland needs to take, that it represents our commitments under the EU 2020 package. So these are our climate change targets, essentially. But what the blue bars show are our emissions, which, while they sort of levelled off, dropped slightly and levelled off during recession, have begun to rise again. And the bottom two graphs here take that for agriculture and transport, two areas in particular that are rising and are projected to rise further. And I think what's really important here to illustrate is that the EPA projections for Ireland's emissions rising are not us trying, it's not the status quo, it's not how emissions would go if we weren't trying to do anything. The projections are inclusive of all of our policies and all of the measures that we're putting in place to try and reduce emissions. So in other words, we're planning to fail to meet our emission targets. It's inclusive, it's our best case scenario in terms of existing policies and measures. So again here, I think that that's just a really important context to put our evaluation of Ireland's progress. So recommendation 2 in today's report rightly states that this is one of our worst areas of performance, and rightly states that sustainable development starts with a sustainable environment. However, maybe in allocating Goal 13 moderate progress, I suppose I would suggest that maybe underplays the significance of this area in particular in terms of the global picture and the impact, the negative impacts it can play on developing countries. So that's just 2 PCD issues that I've chosen to sort of tease out from the report. And to conclude really, I guess to commend again the authors of the report. I think it's a really fantastic contribution to providing that evidence base for decision making towards the achievement of Sustainable Development Goals. And I think, as I say, in this year in particular, as Ireland develops its voluntary national review, you know, this will be providing some really critical evidence base for that reporting and hopefully policy making arising. And I would, I suppose, just to emphasise those other 2 ways of reporting in terms of policy coherence for development and contribution to the achievement of goals overseas. And I really hope and challenge Ireland to report on those as Germany did. And while I have the podium, I might make just two small references. One, David Donoghue, who was the ambassador for Ireland to the UN during the negotiation of the Sustainable Development Goals. He co-chaired the working group that resulted in the agreement with Kenya. We'll be speaking at an event, the Trocher's Lenten Lecture, on the 6th of March. So if you're interested to come and hear David speaking, I'd encourage you to do so. And secondly, Trocher does have has recently launched a series of for educators, resources for teachers and educators in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals. So please do visit our website to access those and download those resources for free. Thank you.
So thanks very much, and getting us into a broader perspective, if you like, and much appreciated. So I think maybe we could start with some questions again. We have some time, and again, we'd ask you to ensure that you have the microphone before you speak, so that those who are watching it online can actually hear the question, if you like. So, who has questions, issues, comments? Yes, right there.
Thank you very much. My question is to Niamh, and it's Irish Aid is currently updating its policy paper on development, and I understand that Simon Coveney, the Taoiseach, has indicated a plan to try and reach the 0.7% target by 2030. So I'm just wondering if Trocher and the other civil society development NGOs have had an opportunity to input into the draft white paper as yet, or if you know what's happening in relation to it. Thank you.
We'll take a number of questions together, so we can then answer them together as well. Eric, yes.
I've heard it said about goal number 8, decent work and economic growth, that some people have a problem with this. I said no problem with decent work, but given all the discussions about economic growth, GDP, should economic growth be in as a 50% of a sustainable development goal? Thank you.
Good question. Other questions or comments that people might want to? Yes? Okay. Wait. Okay.
Yes, it's again a question on tax. I just wonder, could you comment on those figures? We have one of the lowest corporation tax rates, 12.5%, which is actually, I think, a big factor in leading a race to the bottom in corporate taxation, which is affecting every country and eventually going to affect the income and the possibility to realize the sustainable development goals of very many countries. And at the same time, locally, we have one of the highest rates of VAT, which is also a very big factor in increasing poverty within Ireland. I think our taxation policies are really crooked and ought to be challenged.
Okay. Pierre, there. Just wait for the microphone. Okay.
Yes, thank you. I'm very happy to have had the opportunity to listen to all of you today. One question more for the ones who are really into looking about all the indicators and available. Would you have some information about people who are looking for some additional index or some things, as a little bit taking what Sean said, which is not counted yet? I'm just giving an example, and again, I'm interested if there are other approaches, other processes going on around the world. ATD is trying now to do a kind of work in 6 different countries, in the global south and in developed countries, to try to create a new sets of indicators with people who experience severe poverty, because they always feel that some aspect of their lives and their sufferings are not at all presented by what we count today. And I was wondering whether from your side you would have some information about are things which you know are not at all counted yet, and you would like to see them counted.
Okay. Maybe we could take some of the questions now, and then we'll come back. So we'll come back for more questions. Niamh, the first question about Irish Aid, and that I think was directed to yourself.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Yes, so we were delighted to hear Minister Coveney and indeed the Taoiseach announce, as was a renewed commitment to meeting the 0.7% target, and would really very much like to see what that sort of action plan towards getting there will look like. In terms of the consultation itself, we understand that it will be announced in March what the form of the consultation will look like. So we know that the consultation process will likely be somewhere between March and June, but until it's formally announced, the specific modalities for engaging, we've yet to see. If it's anything like the last time round, the development of the One World, One Future, there were opportunities, I suppose, for online submissions, as well as a series of regional in Ireland sort of face-to-face meetings in terms of public consultations. Whether that will be part of the new consultation, we're not sure yet, but we hope to engage with all of our colleagues and allies in Stop Climate Chaos, and indeed the Coalition 2030 as part of that consultation.
Okay, thanks. The second question, the one on growth and work and growth, Michael, do you want to have a look at that one?
Was that the one that whether 50%
Yes,
of...
exactly.
Well, offhand, no. I mean, 50%. I mean, that's getting to one of these, like these magic bullet measurements. If only we had one measurement that could, measure poverty or low pay or anything else. Or, if we had a measurement that could measure half of it. It's a shortcut. I mean, everybody, we've heard this today about how the shortcomings of GDP are in terms of measuring quality of life. But also the fact that, in any event, Ireland's GDP is not fit for purpose, even on that score. So no, it shouldn't be 50%.
Should the growth issue be there at all as a measure?
Yes. Growth has to be an issue, merely because populations rise, merely because you want to increase people's living standards of prosperity. For instance, don't forget, 50% of all people in work earn less than 30,000 euros a year. 50% earn less than that. And that 30,000 is far less than the average. Now, how do you raise their incomes? You raise them through growth, but you raise them through two things. One, an inclusive growth, and one is a sustainable growth. I mean, would anybody mind if the GDP or the GNI or whatever we use reflected the growth of renewables? Well, it would, because I'll tell you this, if we had more renewables, we would be importing less fossil fuels and we'd be generating our own activity, so the drop in imports would automatically increase GDP. Is there anybody who would object to that? I don't think so. And I think that, for instance, reducing poverty. Poverty is one of the main burdens on national output. Never mind being a burden on the people who have to suffer it. If you reduce poverty, if you reduce low pay, that is going to increase your national output. That part, that's what measures, is a good thing.
Good. Thanks, Michael. Moving on to the question of taxation and the 12.5% and that whole series of questions there. Catherine.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I think, Ireland's tax rate is clearly very attractive from the point of view of how it affects businesses. At the same time, I think the very fact that in our index we include this tax haven indicator, which suggests that the perception is that all is clearly not right with the world or not right with Ireland and its taxation system, says something about how we should be measuring progress and how the tax spillovers certainly need to be considered. Interestingly, when you mentioned the whole idea of spillovers, I think that there has been a move, certainly by the likes of Jeffrey Sachs and co, to make the spillover effects ever more important in the SDGs, in his SDG dashboards. And indeed, when they launched their report in November, they specifically focused on how countries' performances will spill over into the less developed countries, and particularly important for what Niamh was speaking about. So I would hope that going forward, that these kind of indicators will increasingly become a lot more transparent in the Sustainable Development Goals, and certainly the tax one is something that is going to come up again and again, and I'd like to see it given it its true importance. I think it needs to be in there somewhere.
Okay. Michael, you want to comment on that as well?
Just a brief comment. First on the corporation tax. Yes, there's a problem with 12.5%, and we see a lot of countries reducing their statutory rate. But I think for the purposes of Ireland, and for, say, the purposes that Niamh had in that one chart about, the outflow of money from the developing countries, the issue is the accommodative tax regime whereby profits that are generated in other countries are taxed here through a district and accountancy device. That is what's getting other countries up in arms. They don't really care about the fact that we charge 12.5% on bookies and hamburger joints. They don't care about that. If that's what you want to do, that's fine. But what their real concern is that literally we are stealing profits. We are eroding the tax base of other countries by effectively being a tax haven conduit. So that's the key thing. And I'm not saying the 12.5% is not problematic, but that is the key thing, is that shifting of profits. And secondly, sometimes the headline rates can give a wrong indication in terms of VAT. Actually, the highest VAT rates in Europe are in the Nordic countries. Sweden and Denmark have 25% standard VAT rate compared to our 23. They also have VAT on food, which most of the food is exempt. So you would look at those places and say, wow, it must really, because it is quite a regressive tax. And yet they have the least amount of poverty, least amount of deprivation, least amount of inequality. So sometimes it may appear on the surface that you have at least one part of your taxation is highly regressive. But at the end of the day, taxation and expenditure are two sides of the same coin, so it depends on what you do on the other end. They seem to be doing something right.
I suppose I'd add myself that Social Justice Ireland has been arguing for some time for a minimum effective corporate tax rate, so that no matter what the breaks are, you have to pay a minimum. And one of the things that's very obvious is that there's a whole industry around doing what Michael has said about transferring the money and charging the profits, or listing them as profits in different places, and Ireland getting a bad reputation for what it's doing in that space. We need a fairer tax system. We also need a higher tax take, but it has to be, like, we have to think that through a bit, in the sense that with GDP so problematic as a number in Ireland, I think we have to rethink where we're going with that. But that's in train, I think. Certainly we're going to come with some suggestions fairly soon about where those benchmarks should be moving forward from here. There's also exactly Pierre's question. Yes, so do you want to have a
just on the indicators? Interestingly, I mean, currently the UN list of official indicators amounts to 232. So there's a lot of indicators out there that are suggested we collect data on. The Eurostat have recently suggested that probably only about 35% of those are actually fully functional at the moment, as in they have been agreed, there is data being collected on them. So there's a lot of information that we're not collecting, and a lot of data there that clearly is relevant to the UN for all countries, not just the developing countries, but for the developed countries also, that we're not collecting information on. And you're absolutely right. I mean, if it's not counted, I mean, we emphasised our analysis is strictly based on what we can measure. And if we're not measuring it, it's not going to get captured, which means it doesn't get counted, it doesn't get included in policy. So my sense is that it's not that we need to agree on more indicators, I think we need to be serious about actually collecting them, collecting the evidence, collating them. Hence why we say, you know, these data indicators for the likes of the environment in particular, we need to be serious about how we measure these things and how we collect the data and how we track them over time. So it's not so much more indicators, it's let's get serious about actually collecting the ones that we know are important.
I could suggest maybe one additional piece, which I think is something close to your own heart, the sort of experience of people who are in poverty or in deep difficulties, or suffering deep exclusion, that their experience be brought in some way into this process. And I think the key is what Paul was saying earlier on about governance. I think that's where that particular issue needs to be picked up as well. So let's take a look at how that might go and so on. Yes, Niamh.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd really echo that in terms of the governance. So in the build-up to the process for deciding the Sustainable Development Goals, we would have worked in 6 countries, mirroring ATD, 6 countries, with communities to try and get a sense of prioritisation in order to feed into the process. And, you know, while issues around health, around education and so on certainly came up as really high priorities for the communities that we engaged in, that idea of voice, the ability to have a influence decision-making at the very local level as well as at the higher level, was a really high priority for the countries that we had worked with at that time. So I'd be really interested to hear the results of ATD's work and you know, if there are sort of indicators around that sort of concept of voice and influence at the different governance levels. I think would be really rich theme to investigate.
All of which makes the point that this is an ongoing project, you know, I mean, the whole thing. So other questions? Yes, Sarah.
Thank you. A couple of questions
this is coming from cyberspace.
on the web.
Yes.
One, Sean is asking you, do you think that a zero poverty target is actually possible for Ireland, perhaps to the rest of the panel also. And another one asking, is the radical change that Ireland will need to make to meet our climate change obligations compatible with the economic growth and investment in services that we need?
Good. To answer the question directly, of course, zero poverty is possible. I have spent many years doing the mathematics of this in a very simple way for TDs and other skeptics who believe that it's impossible to reach zero poverty. Of course you can reach zero poverty. That doesn't mean that that there aren't people with difficulties that have to be addressed and all that sort of stuff. But given how we measure poverty, it wouldn't be difficult actually at all. If we were serious, we'd be at zero. We'd be already at zero poverty. So that's doable. And if anybody has problems with how it can be done, we're quite happy to demonstrate very quickly how it can be done, but not now. The question about climate versus economic growth is a constant one that comes up in this kind of situation. Can we meet our climate targets and at the same time have the economic growth that we seem to require and be planning for and so on? So does anybody want to lead off on that? Sure, but
take a go at it, but I'd really welcome any other inputs.
I think we might wrap up with this question actually, because we're kind of a little bit over time as it is even, you know. But far away, so we'll come across. Yeah,
Great.
absolutely.
Okay. Well, I mean, I think a lot of the narrative around climate change and economic growth is often dominated by that idea that tackling climate change is all about the costs of tackling climate change. Whereas there is far more, I suppose, to the discussion around the opportunities around climate change. So it already came up maybe in some of the earlier inputs in terms of renewable energies. There's a huge, Ireland has huge resources in this area. It's a huge, I suppose, untapped potential in terms of job generation, switching domestic production of energy from energy that's imported, etc. There had been work done by by businesses in Ireland which have highlighted the number of jobs, new job creation around climate opportunity. So I think there's a lot of different avenues for looking more at the opportunities around climate change rather than the negatives. I think what will be important is that you're talking about, I suppose, different type of growth. So not necessarily growth in the areas where we have maybe planned or are committed to growing. So maybe in relation to the agriculture sector, that would be one case in point in terms of, I suppose, our commitment to beef and dairy, and how that is the carbon implications of that. And I think so we're talking about different type of growth maybe from what we had planned. And what's really important, I think, in thinking that through is that concept of the just transition. So there will be winners from the shift to more renewable, more green economy, but equally there will be losers. And what's really important then is how the government prepares for that transition so that we can protect, I suppose, workers who maybe are losing out in some areas and supporting job creation in other areas.
Yeah, just two quick things. I mentioned the impact on renewables on the economy, which means importing less fossil fuels. And eventually, of course, renewables will be cheaper than fossil fuels in times. I think that when you pose this question of, is taking action on climate change going to detract from economic growth? What we assume is that, we look at all the different costs and then try to subtract that, mentally subtract that from growth. However, we don't do the counterfactual. What happens if we take no action on climate change? What are the costs likely to be on that, and then subtract that away? So in one sense, we're looking at costs that are actually against what's happening now, and trying to imagine what would happen, okay, if we didn't take those actions, we'd save on those, but then all of a sudden we might hit more severe costs going down the future. And just one example this morning, no harm for myself physically anyway, but I live around Croke Park, I walked here from Croke Park. Because quite simply, there was no sense in getting in a bus I'd probably arrive just about now. The traffic was just absolutely incredible. I mean, even on a small scale like that, in making cities livable, we are going to have to do some serious thinking and rethinking on this.
Well, I suppose we concluded in our paper with, I wouldn't call it a note of despair, but certainly it was perhaps, not the most positive of ways to finish up. But we suggested that if we continue the way we're going currently, that we are not going to meet our targets for 2020 under the environmental indicators and the environmental indexes. So, I really don't think we have a choice. We have to start doing something differently. We have to make sure that we align whatever definition we use of economic growth with our commitments to climate change. Bottom line is we can't continue to use the planet's resources the way we are. And I think we have to realise that, we want this planet to be around for a long time. We need to get serious about it.
Thanks, Catherine. So I might just say a word or two. I think I should stand up. So a few things, a few announcements first, and then I'll get to thank yous. Those of you who are here can pick up flyers on it's a restarted MA in Social Justice and Public Policy that Social Justice Ireland is involved in with WIT in Waterford. It is an MA that is a WIT MA taught in this building, so in this actual centre. So it's Dublin, the work takes place here. Just that it's there, it'll start this September and registration's already moving ahead, and you can get all the information you want on it on the WIT website. There's links on our centre, on our site to it as well. There's also standard plug that we do in this kind of situation. We have things over there. All of this stuff costs money. You might join us as a member, support us financially. It isn't that it's a huge amount of money to join us, it's not, but it makes a contribution, but it also provides or gives us the support that anybody joining us and becoming a member, and that's very much appreciated by ourselves, by our board and by our staff. And now I want to say a few thank yous. I think I want to say a special thank you to the authors, to Charlie Clark in New York, to Catherine Kavanagh in UCC, to Niamh Lenihan in CIT. They did a wonderful job, I think, in producing an excellent study. And Charlie, if you're watching us in New York, get well soon. We're all rooting for you. The actual publication will be on the website. Is on the website, on our website at this time, so you can get it, download it. There's no problem there. It should be on the front page of it by now. But anyway, that's if everything went according to plan. I want to say a special thank you to the two responders who gave us a mighty range in terms of ideas and comments, and I think that were very, very welcome. So to Michael and to Niamh, thank you very, very much for reading the whole thing. To Philip Barrett back there, still working away on putting together his cartoons, and some of them are up around here already. For those on the web, you might have seen them on the shots, but we will actually have them up on our website in due course. I want to say a very special thank you to the team that did the live transmission. It's Kairos Communications, and they're a powerful operation. They're an extraordinary team that we have used on a number of occasions, and they come in, they're almost invisible, and they work. They all know what they're doing. They all work away, set it all up. They were here at 7:30 this morning setting this place up, and everything slots, and it's as if you were inside in a studio, and that the stuff was there the whole time. And they do this in a tremendous way. They do a very good quality broadcast, and we just really appreciate that. So thank you very much to Coherence. A special word also to the Carmelite Centre here and the staff and all the help that they have given us, and to all the support staff and our own staff. There's a lot of different people involved in delivering this kind of stuff. So we're very grateful to everybody. For those who spent the time or a part of the time with us online, we're more than grateful for the fact that you're spending time with us and plugging into our live transmission. The recording will be available on YouTube immediately and on our website, and is accessible at any time. If you still want to send us comments or whatever, feel free to do that by simply sending them to conference@socialjustice.ie. So to everybody then, a special thank you, and that's it for our event, if you like, and publication for Global Justice Day 2018. Thank you.